And so Microsoft doesn't know which of those you're going to use, Yammer or Teams.
They don't call it Yammer.
Yeah, it's not called Yammer anymore. Stop calling it Yammer.
Viva Can Opener or something. I forget what the new name is.
That's what it is. Viva Can Opener.
I got it right.
Let us get started. It is September 6th. Ask Sympraxis, and we have a full contingent of the Sympraxis team here today. Today's topic is managing permissions in modern SharePoint. And this is a pretty good topic because things have changed with SharePoint. So we're going to talk about the introduction of Microsoft 365 groups, which happened a very long time ago, but I think there's still a lot of confusion about that, so that makes this a fairly good topic. We're going to talk about content management in the construct of permissions, a permissions overview between communication sites and team sites, and there's that's where the goodness really happens, I think. Permission better practices, and then some things that we consider bugs that others that others in the Microsoft home world might think are actually features, and then a little talk of dynamic groups. So that'll be good. All right, Todd, why don't you start us off by helping us all understand Microsoft 365 groups?
Yes. So when we were talking about this slide yesterday in our prep session, I mentioned that several years ago I was talking to the product manager for this, and I was like, what are these? At that time they were Anko 365 groups. I'm like, what are these groups thing? And he's like, come on, this stuff is easy. And I'm like, and we were at an event. We were at Ignite or Tech Ed or something. And he's like, I've got the 75-minute session later today that explains it all. And I'm like, well, which is it? Is it easy, or does it take 75 minutes to explain it to me? I feel like there's a lot of space between them. And they've only gotten more complicated in that sense then. So we decided to spend some time just kind of going around that. So when I talk about groups to people, I kind of like to know my audience. So if I'm talking to IT pros, I say groups aren't complicated. They're just like Active Directory groups that you're used to, security groups. Except when you create them, when you get your SharePoint site and it creates this group and you get SharePoint like you're expecting, but then off in the background, these little robots run off into Microsoft 365 and they create you a distribution list and Exchange. They might create you a team in Teams. They create you a plan and Planner. But that's what this group is. It's just like your group in AD, except you get all these things with it. Or if I'm talking to end users, I say Microsoft 365 groups are just like a distribution list at Exchange. You create the distribution list, you add some people to it, that gets created in the cloud, and then when that happens, a bunch of little robots run off into Microsoft 365 and they create a SharePoint site and a Teams team and a Planner plan. And that's kind of the way to look at it. So this is a unified permission object that gives you permissions to all of the different apps inside of Microsoft 365. So I threw some icons in there. The reason that Microsoft foisted this upon us was because as things were in the cloud, services started to overlap a little bit. And it didn't make sense, for instance, for Teams to find a way to store files when right down the hall, there's this SharePoint team who's got this great product that stores files. So, they take the chocolate and the peanut butter, you mix your Teams with your SharePoint, so you can be in Teams and share files, but then you got to make sure the permissions are the same. And that's kind of the problem that Groups is trying to solve. So SharePoint doesn't have to have mail because Exchange has it. It doesn't have to have a real-time chat because Teams has it, so on and so forth. So Groups, it gives us this one pane, sort of, to manage the groups for all this one-stop management for all these things. And if you make the permission change at the group level or at the app level, it goes to all the other ones. And another great advantage of it is compliance and governance. So now that if you set some sort of permission or something in Exchange for the distribution list, that permission is also in Teams, that permission is also in SharePoint, all of that kind of stuff. Greg is trying to steal some thunder. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, Greg. Don't be looking ahead, follow along. So what's in it for us as practitioners in M365? Well, I'll begrudgingly admit that it's a little easier to manage those permissions because, again, you can't just change the permission at the group level, and then that person has access to the SharePoint site, the Teams team, all that kind of stuff. It also makes it easier for your users to move into using other services because you don't have to worry about making sure they have the right permissions and everything's kind of bolted together. When somebody uploads a file in Teams, they don't realize that it's in SharePoint, and then they show into SharePoint like, hey, I recognize all this stuff. So it does help with that. They are created automatically. You don't have to think about it. As a matter of fact, you have to go out of your way to not get a group when you create a team. Well, you can't with Teams, you have to have a group. But with SharePoint, you have to go out of your way to not have a group. So you don't have to even think about it. And if you do have some non-grouped things like SharePoint sites, team sites, for instance, you can bolt that on later. So if you have legacy ones, since before groups came out, you can groupify a SharePoint site that is not grouped, and that creates a new group for that. Or you can, and then if you have a group, by default, when you create a group, it doesn't create a team because another product whose name I don't want to say, but I have to, Yammer, can also use groups. And so Microsoft doesn't know which of those you're going to use, Yammer or Teams.
They don't call it Yammer.
It's not called Yammer anymore. Stop calling it Yammer.
Viva Can Opener or something. I forget what the new name is.
That's what it is. Viva Can Opener.
I got it right. So you have to sometimes teamify a group depending on how you create it. If you create it in Teams, obviously you get the group of Teams. If you create it in SharePoint or somewhere else, you have to teamify it later. If you've ever created a SharePoint site that's group connected and you get that little thing in the corner that says, hey, have you heard about real-time collaboration? That's what you're doing if you click that. You're teamifying your group. And to answer Greg's question earlier, if you delete any part of the group, you delete everything in the group. So if you create the team that was created when the group was created, it deletes the team, just like Yask, but it also deletes the group, which deletes the SharePoint site, which deletes the distribution list and all that kind of stuff. Now there are warnings everywhere about that, but when groups first came out, that was not the case. And so I learned the very hard way 2 things one day. I learned that when you delete one part of a group, in this case, the planner plan, it deletes the whole group, the SharePoint site and all that. And I also learned that it pulls out of the recycle bin in like 30 some days. And if your users don't notice until like 40 days, then it's just all gone. So that was hard lessons learned all the way around that day. But
I
yes,
absolutely know that to be true, but it is weird that now, and I know this from doing some testing for some deployment stuff recently, that if you delete a team site, SharePoint team site that has a Microsoft 360 group, it does have a checkbox that says, do you want to delete the group too? And I'm like, why are you giving me that checkbox? You're just going to delete it anyway. So I don't know what that checkbox does. But just
that's
FYI.
Interesting. Yeah, because you can't have a group without a SharePoint site.
I have no idea. We have a really good question from Casper about why no group on a comp site. I think we should pin that because we have a slide later.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I don't have it on this site, but one of the limitations for a SharePoint, folks, is groups have 2 levels of permissions mostly. Owner, which means you can do anything at the management level, add people, all that kind of stuff. And then a member, which means you have all full control of the content. You can add, delete, create, and all that kind of stuff. For a SharePoint,
you're going to get to be able to talk all about that in like 4 slides.
Never mind then. That's a teaser, folks.
Jeez, Todd, you're not going to give us any other chances to say anything.
So excited. Next,
He is. He's so excited. He got to talk this time. You know what it is? We let him have let him have the whole show 2 weeks ago, and now he's just
drunk
off the rails.
Power. Yep.
Drunk with power. Yeah, exactly. Mark, take over for him.
All right. So Todd talked about groups. We're going to talk about permissions on different types. But I wanted to sort of frame it a little bit here. So like, why do we care? One of the things that we believe pretty strongly at Sympraxis, I believe, I know Emily and I see totally eye to eye on this, is that you do your work in one place and you provide your work to be consumed in another many times. So this is a slide that actually comes from the maturity model from Microsoft 365 in the management of content competency, where we talk about how these different apps and services sort of work together to support the kinds of work it takes to build content productively. So typically you build your content in either in Teams or in your SharePoint or OneDrive sites it's all sort of the same place. You know, the content ends up in the same place. You iterate on that content in your sort of team environment, you know, SharePoint team site or a team, and you make sure that you've got something that you believe should see the light of day, and then you share that with people in your organizations through an intranet, typically in a communication site. That's where people consume it. They give you feedback. You go back to the drawing board. You come up with version 2. So that's sort of the model of content management and creation and management that we think about. And so when we talk about the different ways to set up permissions, it's to serve that process, because really, you know, SharePoint and Teams and all of the places where we tend to implement these permissions are about creating and managing content and collaborating around it.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide, please.
Yes, I think that is a really good way to help like set the stage. I think too many people come at it from like just trying to figure out the permissions first and not asking the good questions of why they're actually doing it. And I think then it's just really quick and easy to figure out the permissions when you come at it from that perspective. So communication sites then, and so we can also answer Casper's point, or question, excuse me, about, you know, why not a group here? So.
Well, we have a bullet. We don't have to answer it. Just, there aren't any. Yeah, there isn't a Microsoft 365 group behind a communication site, because the idea is that you manage the permissions very, very tightly for communication sites. You tend to only have a couple of owners. You may have site members, but it's not a place where people collaborate. It's not a place where we're like working on multiple versions of a document and sort of kicking around ideas and iterating and collaborating and chatting and all that sort of stuff. It's a place where we sort of, I think of it as the showroom for the, yep, you guessed it, sausage factory, right? It's where we
decided it was going to be ice cream.
Tofu pot, the ice cream shop. Nobody needs to know what happens in the back room. You get to see the front room and see, you know, the end product, and that's really what communication sites are intended for. So that's probably the primary reason why there isn't a Microsoft 365 group. It's not a place where we do that stuff. So.
Well, so I want to jump in here. So the thing I was going to talk about before on the other slide was groups don't have read-only. And groups don't have read-only because it doesn't scale to all the other products. Like how would you implement read-only in Teams? Like it doesn't make any sense. And so because of that, you got the least common denominator of permissions, which removes read-only. But like Mark was saying, when you have a comm site, it's supposed to be read-only for most people. And so I think that's the real limitation. They couldn't put a group behind it because there's no way to do that and have it be read-only.
Multiple reasons, I think. Yeah, so when you're working with a communication site, you typically have 2 to 3 site owners. I wouldn't recommend that you have more than that because it just becomes messy. I was working with a communication site earlier today where they had 15 owners. That's dangerous because then you don't know who's doing what, and how do you make decisions without having some sort of gating factor. You occasionally have site members on a communication site, and that's typically when you bring in somebody to do a specific set of work and then you want them to go. So maybe you're updating images or you're publishing new sets of content into that communication site. But that site member's role ought to be very, very light and often cleaned out. It's not a place where you put your whole team because depending on your culture, you do want to have some sort of gating idea about what goes on to those communication sites. And then site visitors, as Todd said, Microsoft 365 groups don't have a visitor bucket. They don't have a read-only bucket. But with communication sites, once we've launched them, once they're available to the organization, and we usually use them in the context of an intranet, then we give everyone except external users read permission. That's a great pseudo group. It's just free. You don't have to manage it. It's always everybody who's licensed in the tenant. There are exceptions to everything. It depends. There are organizations we've worked with where they might have a, all ex-employees instead of everyone except external users, because they actually want to manage that, and they've got other people that they give accounts to who are outsiders and things like that. But generally speaking, on average, this is a good way to set up your permissions for a communication site.
And I think we're going to slide on dynamic groups later, which could be another option for that. So, all right, so let's move on to team sites then. And Mark, you're going to keep going here.
I'm just going to keep going because you're not going to stop me.
I only got one slide. Why does Mark get 2 slides?
Well, I made more slides.
Oh.
Yeah.
Rookie mistake on my part. And
you're harder to judge. So Emily quietly on the side told me, don't let Todd have more than 1 slide.
It's so tough to judge in so many ways. Like I'm wearing a t-shirt.
All right, so team sites. When I say team sites, I'm also including teams sort of because they can be bolted together. They can be symbiotic. They tend to work together. Not every team site has a Microsoft team attached to it, but usually you tend to attach it because that's where you have those conversations. So team sites or Microsoft Teams are Microsoft 365 group backed. So that's the big difference between team sites and communication sites. You can see in that image on the right, we've got, this is from our sales site. And rather than seeing the people listed there, we have a group called sales owners. Actually, it's a group called sales. And it's got 2 roles, owners and members. That in this case, with a team site, you have that group, you're managing the membership of that group. The site visitor's role here in SharePoint is actually just a SharePoint permission, Todd. So in this case, we've actually given everybody except external users read on this team site, which is a very unusual thing to do. I probably shouldn't have left that on that permission, but we have a very small tenant and we know everybody in there. So as with communication sites, you want to have 2 to 3 site owners. So people who have that role, because that is a role that manages site structure and permissions. So you don't want just everybody managing permissions for your team site. Again, depending on your culture, everything depends. Site members typically are the rest of your work group. So that can be a much larger group. You know, it depends on how large the team is working on a common goal. But really, that's what team sites are about. It's about bringing people together to collaborate to reach some sort of finished product, some sort of process end. It's either a limited time thing, like we're going to have a team site where we're going to plan our summer party, or it's a long-term thing. We're going to have a team site where HR does their work. Site visitors are rarely used. They're not part of that Microsoft 365 group. You typically don't have everyone except external users there, but you might, for example, give your boss's boss's boss read permission on your team sites so that they can just drop in and read stuff. They may ask for full permissions, but if you give them read permissions, then you know that they're able to see everything that they need to see, but they don't necessarily make any changes. So again, these are sort of average typical ways to think about these 2 permission sets for the 2 different kinds of sites.
So there's a question in the chat around, are the perms shown in this screenshot the default when you create a Teams connected site when they're provisioned? And I'm going to move to the next slide because it's site permissions versus group permissions, which I think is the most confusing part of all this. But I believe it is. Isn't that correct? That when you provision a team site, a team connected team site, you get the group names owners in full control, and you get the group name members in limited control by default, but you do not get everyone except external users in site visitors, right? For people.
For sure,
people that do this shit.
Yes,
for private groups.
Yeah, private and public teams or team sites have different behavior. So if you create a public team site, it will actually add everyone except external users to the edit or to the site members. If you do a private team site, then it will not. So I mean, if you think about it, public and private makes sense. There are some teams you just want to let, the summer party one. Let's let anyone who wants to come and work with us on this do it. If it's the figuring out who we're going to fire team, then you probably want to make sure that you don't have people dropping in and jumping into the discussion. So when in a team site, you have two options when you click that add members drop down, which is a pretty bad piece of UI, because when you click add members, you have two options, one of which is not to add members. So you can add members to the group, and they can have a role of either owner or member. So and they're also using the word member in a strange way. Or you can just share the site. So what's the difference? Well, when you add somebody as a member to the group, they may get permissions on a whole bunch of other stuff, because that Microsoft 365 group, as Todd said, is like a security group. So we may give the IT team access to the badging application and all kinds of other things. If we add somebody to that group, then all of a sudden they have the permissions that being a member of that group inherits. If you share the site only, it basically gives them a key to the door that's at the front of the site, and they can come in and do stuff in the site, but that doesn't make them a member of the group. It's a lesser permission level if you think about the context of what a Microsoft 365 group can do across the apps and services in Microsoft 365. I don't think a lot of people understand the difference between those two, and I think a lot of people get added to the group because, well, we just want to give you access to the site. And therefore, the membership of the groups becomes diluted and not necessarily as effective as it should be.
It feels like to me that the thing that we talked about the very beginning, which is sort of like a communication site is, the sausage factory, the ice cream shop, or whatever. I think as a governance conversation, and so this is maybe more of an Emily statement or whatever, but as a governance statement, like, try to stick to that. Like, if you can stick to that, you're going to reduce confusion about what is going on in something, and only break that sort of implied governance rule when there's a really good reason to do it, because it is so much more confusing, right? Like, if you have something that is to be content that is to be created by a few and consumed by many, stick to a communication site. And if you are trying to collaborate as a group, stick to a team site and try not to intermix those as much as you can, and things will be easier. When you have to, but if you do that, that sort of helps.
Yeah, I don't think I made the point, and I want to make sure I make the point that if you keep your permissions at the site level, your life will be the easiest. Yes, right? If you start to poke a lot of holes in the permissions, and you start to say, well, let's create a library for this and a folder that other people have access to, and let me give special permissions to these 3 documents that are spread across a bunch of folders, it becomes a nightmare. There's a reason that you have to use third-party tools to understand permissions. They're complicated, and as soon as you sort of stray from using the site permissions into more specific permissions, you have an administrative headache. And therefore, we have this slide.
Did you notice how I just whoosh, right under there? Yeah.
So if you can stick to the site level. If you reduce permissions, Emily wrote this part, so I want to make sure I get it right. If you reduce permissions inside a team site, that's less of a sort of taxing mental thing than if you expand permissions. So for instance, if you have an HR team site and you set one of the libraries so that everybody in the organization can come in and edit their own resume or something, then all of a sudden you've got people milling around in your HR team site, which just feels wrong. If you reduce permissions, like we've got one library that only the management of HR can get to, that seems to make more sense. And it's sort of consistent with what happens when you create a private channel in Teams, but we're not going to go too far into that. Always have 2 to 3 site owners. It can be, a few more. It shouldn't be less, because there are always times when somebody's not around. I also mentioned the difference between public and private team sites, and I think that's a very important distinction to know when you create a team site, and you have to understand its use case before you make that decision.
Marcel made a comment in the chat about that some people really dislike interacting with SharePoint in a browser, and so they want to stay in Teams, and that's why they're looking for that read-only permission in Teams/groups. I would argue that's the entire point of Viva Connections, and based on like Viva Connections sessions that we've done previously, there's lots of ways to add more sites at that, pinned left rail. So I would argue that that's maybe you should go down the Viva Connections route and surface your communication sites to give people a way into the intranet in Teams, keeping them in context, because I totally understand why they'd want to stay in context. Emily, to quote Nielsen Norman here, whatever that rule thingy is, but I would want to keep them in Teams. I totally get that, but then use the Viva Connections tool, and that's why we have that, and that's why it's so powerful.
If they're interacting with a SharePoint, if they're interacting with SharePoint document libraries, the interface that Teams has is actually pretty much the same. I mean, it's not that different. So it sort of becomes a little bit of a religious war, I think. But if you're consuming content, Viva Connections is more about consumption, right?
Right.
So if we want to expose the intranet in Teams, that's a really good way to just keep people in Teams. You're right.
Yeah. All right. So we've got some group bugaboos. So this is something that we've all experienced at different ways. All our roles have experienced this in different ways. So the owners of the group are often not treated as part of the group. And that is something that I forget and run into quite often. So like audience targeting can't be used for owners. So if you are an owner and you have audience targeting, you're not part of the group. Limit to 10 groups in navigation. So that's for that audience targeting piece. Navigation, keep in mind that navigation is limited to just 10 groups. So if you have an incredibly complicated grouping structure or whatever, and you're thinking that you're going to use that to audience target navigation, that's going to be, that's maybe not going to work for you. And then the sites web part, so Mark found this the other day, apparently the sites web part will not show you sites where you are an owner, which is just like, so that's when you come to us and we'll build you a different sites web part that actually works. And then managing external users in Microsoft 365 groups. So this was definitely one that confused me for sure, is that you have to go to the Outlook web app when entering through SharePoint. And it's just so weird. I don't understand why we have to do that.
Yeah. And a note on that is that's that whole idea that you've got multiple panes. So you don't have to do it in Outlook. You can do it in other places, but that's just where SharePoint takes you, because whichever app gives you access to the group has different settings of group settings.
It's actually because Microsoft ships their org chart and Exchange came up with groups.
Yeah. So groups absolutely came out of Exchange. Yeah. Microsoft 365 groups absolutely started in Exchange. So yeah, that's absolutely right.
Sorry, I just, not to be blunt or anything.
No bluntness here. Not on Aston Praxis. We're not like that. So Microsoft 365 groups, you have a 500,000 group limit in the number of groups per tenant. And so an admin can be the owner of every single one of those groups. So that's essentially then saying admins have no limit, but the limit is the tenant limit. Each user can create up to 250 groups. So if you, as a user, do not have the admin role, you can create up to 250 groups, so i.e. be the owner of 250 groups. Each user can be a member or owner of up to 7,000 groups. So that's like an end game. Like, so maybe you've hit your 250 owner membership, but if you're a member of more than 609, I can't do that math. Why did I start down that road? That's horrible. Whatever the math is, you can't do that. 7,000 minus 250.
I think it's 1/14 pi.
Okay, thank you.
No, yeah, I think
And then 1,000 members can access calendar and conversations concurrently. So that's just fun. Insert math here. I like that, Rob. Thank you for saving me.
We'll put that
Dynamic
math in a
groups.
post.
Todd, quickly, we're running
Hey!
out of time.
Yeah,
We've
yeah,
been
yeah.
chatting a lot.
Yeah.
Kill
so
it quick.
Groups are normally static. Todd gets in, Derek gets in, Mark gets in, Julie doesn't get in, that kind of stuff. But you also have the option of creating a dynamic group so that you can base group membership on something like location. And then as people move offices, Azure handles all that in the background. I got a blog post at the bottom. We talked earlier about the everyone except external. I've created a dynamic group for customers before that says everybody except people whose user ID is null, because that means they're not a user in your domain. Right now, the dynamic group can only be made by an admin, somebody who's got permission inside of Azure to do that because it's all an Azure AD thing. Can't do those in
You want to
SharePoint.
throw out any use cases?
Those were my use cases in the example. So
I
a good
love
one,
it. You
I would
did
say.
it in the
I did.
zhush.
So I will say that a common one we see is managers. So there's the need for manager resources, for example. And then, of course, whenever we have region, you don't want to be spamming everyone about cookies in Cincinnati when there's no cookies in Boston. So making sure that we just tell people highlights that are relevant to them is very helpful too.
Yep, absolutely good use case. So here's some resources for you. Maybe you skipped ahead, maybe you clicked on them already. If you go to our website later and or the YouTube recording later, all the links are going to be there for you, so that will be helpful. And then last but not least, September 20th is our next episode, and we're going to dive into community resources, so things like the PMP and other community resources that we have, but we're going to take the lens of being an intranet owner and how you might think about those community resources from that perspective. Mark and Todd are going to be at CEF in Stockholm, Sweden, coming right up in the next week. Collab Days New England is a big Simpraxis collaboration event, however I mean to say that, and I don't know. Registration is open. October 21st, Burlington, Mass. Please come in person. It is an in-person only event. It is going to be awesome this year. We have a ton of sponsors. We have all sorts of great speakers. We're going to do it up right this year, so definitely come and join us for that live. Also see Derek and I in Chicago at 365 EduCon at the end of October. And so we'll see you all next time, September 20th, for Ask Simpraxis. Thanks for joining us today.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Simpraxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues.